Prologue. Everything vanished suddenly before her eyes. Kiyomi Nagashima had no idea what had happened. The houses she passed every day were reflected in the windshield only a moment ago. Just ahead, the street took its familiar slope downward and bore slightly to the right, where a traffic light had just changed to yellow before vision failed her. Kiyomi tried to blink, but her sight did not return. No matter how much effort she put into it, nothing appeared. They had all gone away. The white sedan driving in front of her, the tail light of the bus waiting at its stop, the cluster of high school girls hastening along the sidewalk. Kiyomi looked down in her confusion to check the steering wheel. Then she was truly shocked. The steering wheel was gone. In fact, she did not even know where her hands were. She could not feel the seat belt around her waist, nor her foot on the gas pedal, for neither was where it was supposed to be. There was only darkness fanning out, continuing endlessly in all directions. There was a churning around her, and she was floating in a warm, viscous liquid. She was naked. Her clothes had vanished without her ever noticing. That dream again. That dream she had once a year, on Christmas Eve, in which she felt herself writhing in some pitch-dark world without beginning or end. She'd always had that strange dream. This was the dream. And she was now entering into it again. But she did not know why she was having it just now. Like the star's orbits, the dream always came to her with regulated precision. She never dreamt it on any other night but Christmas, and had certainly never entered into it while she was awake. Her body was changing profoundly. She lost all feeling in her arms and legs. Maybe they'd actually vanished. Head, torso, and hips gone. A body long and gnarled like a worm's. She felt herself to be. Kiyomi shook and slithered head through the slightly sticky blackness. What is this place? It was a question she had asked many times before. Her body seemed to recall this place, yet no matter how much she tried, Kiyomi herself could not remember. Once, in some far-off place, Kiyomi was just like this, not understanding anything, just squirming and swimming. That much was true. Had it been yesterday, a recent year, or in the more distant past? She could not tell. To begin with, it was not clear that time flowed in this vast gloom. Kiyomi felt her body changing again. Something small divided slowly deep inside of her. At the same time, she felt a gentle restriction in her very center, and the ends of her body flowed quietly in opposing directions. She was becoming two. There was a strangely tranquil feeling. Time seemed to pass so gently, slowly. Where am I? When is this? What am I? Such mundane concerns no longer mattered. She wanted only to remain floating like this in the dark. She gradually split in half. There was no pain. Rather, she was insensate, and that was bliss. Everything sedate, no turmoil, dividing like it was natural. Calm. All was calm. Kiyomi let all her nerves relax as she slowly surrendered herself to the flow. Her vision was then completely restored, just as unexpectedly as it had abandoned her. She clearly saw now her own two hands grasping the steering wheel. Kiyomi blinked, then looked straight ahead. She was heading straight into a telephone pole. Part 1. Development. First part. Until the phone rang that morning, it was the beginning of an average, uneventful day for Toshiaki Nagashima. At 8:20 a.m., Toshiaki parked his car at the School of Pharmaceutical Sciences. The lot was still more than half empty. Briefcase in hand, he got out of the car and locked it. He looked up indifferently at the pharmaceutical center. Rising 6 stories high, the building was steeped in somber gray beneath the cloudy sky. In the entrance lobby, Toshiaki changed into a pair of sterile sandals, and then took the elevator to the 5th floor. Double doors opened to reveal a corridor extending in both directions. Far back to the right was the lecture hall, where he taught his course on advanced methods in biofunctional sciences. It appeared that most of the students and other staff members had yet to arrive, for not a sound could be heard. However, late mornings were not unusual. The other organic science courses were quite different, entire staffs assembling and seminars beginning at 8 a.m. Toshiaki's course was an exception, in that they wasted no time on finding fault with their students' time management skills. Instead, he and his colleagues stressed that what mattered was for the students to conduct their experiments and present the data. As a mere research associate, Toshiaki made an effort to arrive by 8:30, but this was a non-commitment required of him. He opened the lab door to Lab 2, which housed his desk, turned on the light, and entered. After hanging his coat, he placed his briefcase next to the bookshelf. 2 chemical agent order forms had been written up and left for him on the desk by his students the night before. Specifically, requests for the restriction enzymes ECO R1 and BAM H1. Toshiaki attached the forms together with a paper clip and pinned them to the desk side wall. Looking over the notes he'd made the day before, he began to prepare for his experiment. First he left the lab and keyed open a door just down the hall, which led into the cultivation room. The room's interior was imbued with an ultraviolet sterilizing light, which he switched to an ordinary fluorescent light as he stepped inside. He took 2 plastic culture flasks from the incubator and placed them under a microscope. He adjusted the focus and peered through the lenses, gazing at the cells at the other end. After ensuring he was satisfied with their condition, he returned the cells to the incubator, and then removed a few implements from the autoclave and placed them into the clean bench. Toshiaki returned to his lab and removed several testing chemicals from the refrigerator. And just then, Sachiko Asakura, a second-year master's student he had been mentoring, walked in. "Good morning," she enunciated pleasantly as she entered. Toshiaki returned the greeting like an echo. Asakura put her coat away, revealing a figure shrouded in a white summer sweater and jeans. She had her long hair tied behind her back. Removing her sweater, she donned a white lab coat. At nearly 5'9", Asakura was quite tall for a woman, shorter than Toshiaki by only an inch or so. When she passed by, she acknowledged him with a smile and a small bow. Asakura's height was greatly accentuated in her long coat, and it was always pleasant to watch her stately figure as it fluttered about the lab during an experiment. Toshiaki informed her he would be in the cultivation room, and with that left the lab. Once the clean bench preparations were complete, he removed the culture flask and commenced his work. The cells he was using, known as NIH3T3, were relatively common. He had, however, introduced retinoid receptor genes into the cells of one of the flasks. 2 days before, he'd placed each receptive cell culture into a new flask and bred them. Then the following day, he'd added a dose of beta-oxidation enzymes into the indicator solutions. Today he planned on collecting mitochondrial data from both cultures. His expectation was that the activity of the beta-oxidation enzymes would be higher for the cells receiving the gene transfer than for the control cells. Just when he began the procedure, there was a phone call. Toshiaki heard the lab phone, but his hands were occupied and Asakura was over there in the lab. He assumed she would take the call. After 3 rings, she seemed to have picked up the receiver. For a dozen seconds, the morning's peace was restored. But soon there was the sudden echo of rushed footsteps. Toshiaki continued working, wondering what was the hurry. Not knowing why, he chanced to glance at the wall clock. The hands indicated exactly 9 a.m. The lab door burst open. "Dr. Nagashima, you have an urgent phone call." As he lifted his gaze slowly, he saw Sakura's face in the doorway, her mouth trembling slightly. "It's from the hospital. Your wife. She's been in an accident." "What?" With that he rose. "3. At 6 p.m. the 3 of them were allowed into the ICU. When they entered the room, they were instructed to change into pale green, sterilized gowns and hats and to wear special masks. In addition, they had to sanitize their hands and feet. As for Toshiaki, he was already familiar with this type of procedure, having performed many experiments on animals in which prevention of infection, and therefore the wearing of such garments came with the territory. But he never imagined he would be wearing them in a hospital setting. Because Kiyomi's father was a surgeon by profession, he became a respectable figure in this attire. Only Kiyomi's mother, visibly annoyed by the sensation of the rough-hewn gown against her skin, was unaccustomed to it. It was an unexpectedly large room. There were a number of stretchers lined against the wall and half as many machines used for blood transfusions. 2 small monitors were installed in the room, from which countless tubes and wires extended. In spite of all the technology, most of the other beds were unoccupied, giving the room a dormant atmosphere. Kiyomi was lying down on the second nearest bed. Tubes had been inserted into her nostrils. Toshiaki followed them with his eyes. They ran from her nose into a bucket-shaped object, and continued from there into a white machine that had several manual controls and a meter with a needle, which quivered from left and right within its prescribed arc. It wasn't a large machine, but every time the needle jumped, a hissing sound ensued. This was the respirator, according to the doctor. The wall monitors were both aglow with Kiyomi's brainwave activity. They all gathered around and gazed upon her. Her head was shaven and wrapped in cloth and bandages, but the rest of her was covered with a simple sheet and no other injuries could be spotted. Aside from the scars on her head, she looked completely unscathed. After leaving the room, the doctors led the way to his office. He offered them a seat and sat down at his desk. Films of Kiyomi's CT scans had been posted to a light box on the wall. As he showed them the brainwave data, the doctor began to explain more about her condition. Brain death, he said, was an irreversible state that occurred when the brain stem was deprived of blood and ceased to function. This was distinct from a vegetative state, where the brain stem was still functional. The hospital was required to verify any potential patient's condition with an officially sanctioned examination in accordance with Welfare Ministry standards. Additional brainwave response inspections, along with more CT scans, are also available at their hospital. These are the results of the first exam conducted at 5 o'clock. The doctor handed them a spreadsheet which contained the results of Kiyomi's auditory brainstem response, pupillary dilation, and respiratory tests. The doctor explained each in detail. He emphasized that there were no noticeable changes in her brainwave activity in the face of stimuli, and that she was not breathing on her own. If she were taken off her respirator, she would cease to breathe, her heart would fail, and her temperature would plummet. On the right side of the form was a blank chart in which the second examination's results, to be conducted the following afternoon, were to be recorded. We will see if the second test yields the same results. By that time, over 6 hours will have passed since the first, and this is how we ensure that no mistake is being made. Toshiaki was only half listening to the doctor's words. He could not dispel Kiyomi's peaceful expression from his mind. We'll leave her as she is for now on the respirator. I would recommend that you discuss as a family the issue of when to take her off it. Until then, you have my word that we will do anything in our power to sustain her. We'll keep her on a nutrient-rich IV, and periodically shift her lying position so she won't develop bed sores. Please understand, though, that while she may be breathing, Kiyomi-san is already in fact dead. They all returned later that evening to the ICU and sat at Kiyomi's bedside. Her father had begun to regain some emotional stability by now, while her mother was still unable to make sense of things, overwhelmed as she was by her tears. The day's hardships had etched weary circles under her eyes. She laid herself down, completely exhausted. Kiyomi's father, realizing the day had been too much on his wife, thought it better to return home and left with her in his arms. Toshiaki was unable to sleep and stayed behind. At around 10 o'clock that evening, a nurse came in to give Kiyomi's body a rub-down with a hot towel. The petite nurse exerted nothing but sweetness. Still in her early 20s, she possessed a genuine sincerity, and the special attention she afforded to Kiyomi struck a chord in Toshiaki's heart. As he helped the nurse with her work, Toshiaki again felt the warmth of Kiyomi's skin. A few beads of perspiration dotted her back, and saliva had welled up in her mouth. Her skin was still firm, cheeks flushed with a pale rouge. Toshiaki had never seen a so-called vegetable, but as he looked upon Kiyomi's body, it was impossible for him to distinguish her from that harsh term. "Please talk to your wife," the nurse said with a smile as she went about emptying Kiyomi's bedpan. "It'll cheer her up." Toshiaki did not doubt the nurse's advice, so he held Kiyomi's hand, talking to her continually throughout the night. He told her about his day, shared memories, and talked about the things he loved most about her. He felt the warmth from her palm passing into him. Her chest rose and fell regularly as the hiss of the respirator echoed through the ICU. Toshiaki went to the university early the next morning, overcome by a sudden desire to be alone. He drove slowly through the streets, which now seemed to him devoid of shadow and form. A faint mist hovered around the campus grounds. As Toshiaki inhaled damp air into his lungs, he walked into the building and went straight to his lab. It was still early, so there was no one else around. He sat down at his desk and leaned back in the chair, letting out a deep breath. Outside the window, the pale houses along the road blurred far into the distant haze. The image of Kiyomi's comatose face wavered in his mind. Toshiaki had witnessed the death of loved ones more than he would have liked, whether from terminal illness or simply old age. You could honestly say he was capable of understanding death. That is, until he saw his wife's body lying motionless on a hospital stretcher. Any previously held notions of mortality no longer applied. But was she really dead? In Toshiaki's delusional state, pessimism encountered the warmth lingering in his hands from the night before in subtle billows of conflict. His knowledge of the controversy surrounding brain death had been gleaned from television, newspapers, and further from various educational materials and medical journals. If anything, Toshiaki's attitude was affirmative. Brain death was to him a scientific matter that was unfairly subjected to sentimental arguments. When there were patients who needed organ transplants in order to survive, why, he wondered, should people hesitate to have replacements extracted from brain-dead donors? He gnawed his lip at the thought of taking organs from Kiyomi's living body. Toshiaki conducted dissections on rats and mice early every day, yet he was far from accustomed to it. It always made him terribly uncomfortable to imagine doing likewise to a human being. In his mind, the image of an anesthetized lab rat, with its stomach cut open, overlapped with that of Kiyomi's nude figure, of the rat's liver and kidneys distorting into her abdomen. Kidneys. Toshiaki shut his eyes. Kiyomi had registered as a kidney donor last year. It all came back to him quite clearly now. Toshiaki thought organ transplantations were something to be lauded. It would be wonderful, of course, if Kiyomi's kidneys could be of any use. Yet because she was still warm with life, and her heart still going strong, he could not let himself be reconciled to the idea of extracting her kidneys. He simply didn't feel that his wife was dead. He was confident that she could go on and live. He opened his eyes. The mist had already dispelled outside, and the buildings along the streets now greeted the dawn, scintillating blindingly in the morning sun. A crow's cry could be heard in the distance. A new day was beginning. For most it would be like any other. For Toshiaki, it would become the day in which the reality of his wife's accident would leave behind its first indelible traces. He needed to move around, but before returning to the hospital he walked over to the cultivation room to check his cell cultures once more. He would replace them with a new batch if they had stabilized. He inspected his flask under the microscope. There was nothing particularly in need of his attention. He gazed vacantly at his hybridoma and cancer cell cultures. Then, without warning, an idea came to him. Toshiaki took his eyes from the lenses and peered at the red indicator solution inside the flask. A voice, filled with wonder, escaped from his lips. "Oh, Kiyomi." His heart was racing. He sprung from his chair. The idea spread swiftly through his mind. As he staggered away, he could not take his eyes from the flasks upon the table. Kiyomi's body undoubtedly suffered extreme brain trauma. Still, when he held her hand, he knew life continued to emanate from her. Not everything in her had died. His eyes still glued to the flasks, Toshiaki clenched his fist and shouted at the ceiling. In his excitement, the hospital was much too far away. He slammed on the gas pedal and changed gears hastily, muttering Kiyomi's name under his breath. There was so much to do. He had to see what Kiyomi's parents thought about offering up her kidneys, re-establish his connections with an old surgeon friend, and ultimately gain the doctor's approval for his plan. He was sure of achieving this all without a hitch. Kiyomi was still alive. Knowing this for sure, tears began to flow from his eyes. "From now on, my dear, we'll always be together." So did his heart cry out. Fourth part. Toshiaki and his father-in-law watched intently as the second examination was carried out. The doctor in charge, whom they had met only yesterday, divided his duties with another. Toshiaki had prepared himself for some grandiose procedure, but in actuality, all they did was place headphones on her and poke her skin to see whether or not she responded to stimuli. Kiyomi's brain waves remained even. The head doctor recorded the results on the chart. Toshiaki mused about how unscientific their methods were. All findings were negative. When he was done, the doctor handed over the form and gave a look that seemed to implore acknowledgement. Toshiaki compared the chart to Kiyomi's face, then returned it to the doctor with a single nod. The doctor accepted the form, signed his name on the top, and stamped it. Kiyomi-san has been judged to be brain dead. Yes. Toshiaki knew he could have said something more appropriate, and was amazed by his own vapid response. Well then, please step into my office for a moment, the doctor said, and led them in. A woman was waiting inside. Upon noticing them, she stood up from her chair and bowed politely. Toshiaki returned the gesture vaguely. This is our transplant coordinator, Azusa Odagiri, stated the doctor by way of introduction. It has been brought to my attention that Kiyomi-san is a registered kidney donor, so I took the liberty of inviting her here. Odagiri handed them her business card. This suit-clad woman looked younger than Toshiaki, and gave the impression of a capable professional. Her piercing eyes contrasted with the gentle curve of her cheek lines, and this imbalance helped give her an air of being approachable. Her expression promised honesty and intelligence. She bowed slightly again and said how pleased she was to meet them. The recipient's transplant procedure could only be consummated when a donor was present. The only available donors, excluding those still living, and depending on the type of treatment needed, were usually patients diagnosed with brain death or heart failure. ER doctors needed to stay focused on their own tasks, so it was undesirable for them to push to perform these operations. On the other hand, if a transplant surgeon approached the patient's family directly for the organs, it invariably ended in hurt feelings. To mediate between transplant and emergency medicine, someone had to deal specifically with all these issues. This was where the transplant coordinator, Odagiri, came in. Hers was a job which spanned many areas and, because of the doctor's overbearing schedules, meticulous familial consolation and care were upheld as the most important of her duties. Toshiaki and his in-laws seated themselves on the couch and faced her. I will get right to the point here. With Kiyomi's kidneys, we could save the lives of 2 dialysis patients. CRF, or chronic renal failure, is a condition that can afflict even the very young. Unfortunately, there is no cure. All they can do is clean up the body through dialysis treatment. But because of the time factors involved, it's nearly impossible for such patients to lead an active social life, and they are under strict dietary restrictions as well. With a transplant of just 1 kidney, such a patient could begin to live normally. I can assure you that these kidneys would by no means be wasted. Toshiaki listened to this earnest appeal and spoke up to discuss details. I understand perfectly well that Kiyomi's kidneys could save the lives of others, and I'd like to donate them for that purpose. It was her wish to register in the first place, and I think we should respect it. So please do what you feel is best in this situation. I only ask that you remove nothing more. I don't know if Kiyomi would have approved of any further extractions. I would never dream of doing anything without her prior consideration. He felt they were conversing like actors in a play. After speaking his mind, he awaited the reaction of his father-in-law, who closed his eyes and managed to nod once in approval. I am truly grateful for your willingness to go through with this. I cannot thank you enough. Odagiri bowed her head deeply in gratitude. I will help you through the entire process to the best of my ability. Toshiaki carefully filled in the transplant consent form that Odagiri presented. In the center of this thin sheet was written, "I hereby consent to the surgical removal of the following organs and tissues from the body of the patient for the purpose of transplantation." There were spaces under each line. This dry sentence had been printed in the middle of the form. In the blank spaces above it, Toshiaki entered his wife's name, address, date of birth, and sex. Then, gathering all of his strength, he circled the word kidneys. At that point he inhaled deeply and, before exhaling, entered in the current date, his surname as the consenting party, address, and relation to the donor. "I'll also need your seal here." Odagiri pointed to a spot at the bottom of a long white finger. Toshiaki took out his personal seal from his front pocket. With great tact, Odagiri removed a red ink pad from her purse and placed it in front of him. Toshiaki pushed down hard on the seal with a slight wriggling motion, affixing it to the form. His name stamp, Nagashima, stood out vividly, almost to the point of lewdness. He averted his eyes for a moment and wondered if he was making the best choice. He had just officially sanctioned the removal of organs from the woman he loved more than anyone. Such a serious decision made by merely signing a single sheet of paper. But this was the right thing to do. Toshiaki shook his head. It was late in the game to be having such qualms. Hadn't he decided that this would extend her life? Didn't this have to be done so that he could be with her always? Kiyomi was not only what was on the outside, but rather every living cell in her body was Kiyomi, and he had to make her his. Toshiaki needed to make his move. Just then a sort of fever seized him. It was the same heat that had visited him when the doctor had told him about Kiyomi's condition. His head began to spin. As they were leaving the office, Toshiaki edged stealthily past his father-in-law over to the doctor and spoke in a hushed voice. "I actually have a request concerning Kiyomi." "Yes?" "Please, just hear me out, and this is to be confidential between us. I want something in exchange for offering her kidneys." "Exchange? What?" The doctor eyed him suspiciously. Toshiaki placed his trembling arm around the doctor's back as if restraining him, and whispered, "Give me Kiyomi's liver. I want to use it for a primary culture."